baking, Sebastian Roussel. They've worked together for 15 years, opened 4 Bouchon bakeries, and have now created the cookbook, Bouchon Bakery. Thomas, Sebastian, welcome to both of you. It's good to have you with us.
It's great to be back.
Sebastian, I want to know, how did you get together with this man?
Well, I was at the time I was in New York City, and I was looking to challenge myself as a professional, and I was looking to work with the chef that was already working at the level that I was looking for.
Uh-huh.
And then a lot of people were talking about Thomas Keller, and I was like, I never heard of him. And even my wife, she was like, you don't know Thomas Keller? He's like one of the best chefs right now in America. I was like, oh, all right, sounds good. And one day my wife saw an ad in the New York Times that he was looking for a new pastry chef. So without telling me, she took my resume and sent it to him. And then one day I came home, and I saw there was a message on the answering machine saying that they would be happy to host me in Napa Valley. And so I was, extremely surprised. And then
so you had no idea?
I had no idea
how these people had called you and why?
I had no idea.
Thomas, for you, what made you look at? I mean, you would have had applications from the world.
It's interesting that you say that, because we don't really. I think people, certainly young professionals, are a little bit apprehensive about applying at the French Laundry, or these days at Per Se. Because it does have such a high reputation, they're not all so sure that they're going to be able to fulfill the expectations, which is quite a shame, because we have had great success in hiring, training, and mentoring some of the great talent today. But to Sebastian's point, I didn't know the story for several years, actually, how he came, how his wife Andrea had sent me his resume. The resume showed up. It was certainly a very impressive resume. Not only did he have his classical training in France, he was also the pastry chef at the Lycée, which is the equivalent of the White House. He worked for a 2-star Michelin chef out of the Wnyc, and then came to New York and was the chef at Lutèce restaurant under Eberhard Müller, who was a chef that I had great respect for. So I get this resume from this young Frenchman who has all this background. I'm going, okay, this is wonderful, and we embarked on what has turned out to be a really fantastic friendship and certainly a great career path for both of us.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the things that you both know and do when you bake that make a difference. And they're usually things that most of us home cooks are just not told about or not aware of. And what I was thinking of was, I think of it as pie pastry, because it's something that I think everyone should know about, because I think it can take you in so many directions. So first of all, Sebastian, with a basic pie pastry or tart pastry, what are the options that you have? I mean, if I want to have a flaky crust, or if I want to have what I understand the French consider to be the perfect crust, which is more like a cookie.
It's more like a cookie crust. But the difference between for me as a Frenchman, I would use the term pâte brisée and not pie crust.
Right.
The pie crust is the pâte brisée, which is a simple mix of flour, butter, salt, and I add a little bit of milk into it.
Why the milk?
To give it a little more a richer consistency, color, and richness. When you bake it, there's a little bit of sugar in the milk, and that's going to give it a nice color.
So the texture now, I want a flaky crust, or I want a crust that's what I'm used to in a French tart, which is really like a cookie.
Mm-hmm. Pâte sucrée. The difference between the two is pâte sucrée has sugar into it,
right,
versus pâte brisée has none.
But the texture, isn't that something about the fat?
Yes. Well, you have the sugar too. The sugar makes the dough a little more crunchy. It gives it a crunch. It's kind of like making cookies, And I'm not sure what's your favorite, but there's always somebody that says chocolate chip cookies. They say that I like mine soft in the center, and some people say I like mine to be crunchy all the way.
Yeah.
And some of those cookies are really crunchy, and the reason why is because it's an enormous amount of sugar.
So,
I like mine soft, chewy in the center.
So less sugar.
Less sugar. Yes. I don't like sweet stuff, and it's kind of ironic for me to say that. But I think a lot of the desserts out there are overly too sweet, and I think you have to learn how to manage the amount of sugar that you add into any of your recipe.
Let's go back to that basic pâte brisée or pie crust. So we're talking about butter, flour, water, milk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but now the temperature of the butter. What should the temperature of the butter be when you're making that pastry crust?
Well, I want to make sure that there is a very fine crust that has every bite is the same. So I want to make sure that there is no chunks of butter. So what I do is I make sure the butter is diced and really cold, and then I'm going to incorporate it in with the flour using a mixer and the paddle, and I'm going to mix those two. But I don't want the butter to get clunky around the paddle. I want every particle of the flour to be covered with fat. I don't want chunks of fat in the dough. So I'm going to keep mixing until the flour grabs onto all the butter, and it becomes a very, we kind of call it like sand. It's got that sand texture to it. But I want to make sure it doesn't clump together.
Is that going to protect it from being a tough crust when you add liquid? Because you're told once you add liquid, you have to be very careful because this is where the gluten...
Yes, in flour, the more you mix the flour with any kind of liquid, you start developing the gluten that you have in the dough. And a lot of the reason when you roll the dough in the next step is the dough has tendency to shrink. You start rolling and then the dough comes back together. So it's because you mix your dough too much in the mixer prior. So when you add the liquid into it, you just want to mix it in the first gear and then just enough to combine all the ingredients together. And sometimes it's actually better to finish manually than using the mixer.
So just finish the blending by hand.
Yep.
So now, in writing the book, you're thinking about someone who's cooking at home, but because everything you do, you're doing on a large scale in the bakeries, were there some things that you ran into that sort of changed your thinking about how you work or how the recipes can work?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because it's true, we get comfortable in a professional kitchen where we have, beautiful equipment. But then when it's time to do it at home, so, even for me, it was a challenge.
I think one of the beauties about Bouchon Baker Cookbook is that the recipes are written in grams, metric.
That's hard for people, though.
Well, no, it's actually much easier because you get precision. We talk about baking, and baking is precise. We all know that if the three of us, scooped out a cup of flour, that we'd have 3 different weights.
That's right.
And therefore, it's not going to be the precision that we want. So, if you're dealing with cups and teaspoons, it's kind of an archaic approach to really baking at a high level.
Yeah, well, when I said it's hard, I mean in the sense of getting us used to weighing.
Everybody gets on a scale like once a week. That's not hard for them. They weigh
some of us
themselves.
less, but that's another thing entirely. Thank you both so much.
You're welcome.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thomas Keller and Sebastian Rouxel are authors of Bouchon Bakery. Now, you can find their recipe for Pasrty, also known as pie crust, and their butter continuum, which is their guide to working with butter, on the website, splendidtable.org. What a dream. 2 people curious about food, the chef with serious restaurant chops, the writer and the designer who knows how to handle a camera, and an agenda taking them around the world. 12 countries in 18 months. Well, this is theperennialplate.com. Its creator, Chef Daniel Klein, and videographer Mira Fine are here, and they're just back from a remote part of eastern Turkey. Welcome back from the latest adventure, you two.
Thanks, it's so good to be back.
So what part of Turkey were you in?
Kars, which is a town in the eastern part of Turkey, right on the Armenian border, and it's really well known for its honey. There's about 70,000 people who live in Kars, and they have 65 honey shops.
Oh my.
Yeah, so if you use that ratio in New York City, it's like 1 honey shop every 2 blocks. It's amazing. But outside of Kars, in the countryside, it's dotted with all these little tiny villages, which is kind of like stepping back in time. They look like they're built in these old ruins. They keep cooking traditional methods, herding animals, and many of them have been honeybee keepers for generations.
And there are lots of folks who keep bees, but the real traditional way is unfortunately dying out in the region. So most of the time when you eat honey, the hives are fed with sugar.
They usually eat around half the honey in the hive. But so most people who do commercial beekeeping will feed sugar so that they don't lose any honey from their hive.
Mm-hmm.
So these traditional beekeepers in Kars are very strict and very adamant about not giving any sugar to their bees. So they are willing to sacrifice and actually not harvest any honey for a year if it's a bad year, because they want their bees to stay in this natural way. So they generally split the hive in 2. They take half the honey and leave half the honey for the bees.
Does this honey taste very different from other honeys that you've had from other places?
It tastes so good.
Is it very intense?
It is. It's intense. It kind of gives you a little bit of a tingle on the back of your throat. I don't know if that's because there's a little more pollen in it or what it is, but depth. And the honey is also special because up in the mountains, it's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
There's no crops, so there's no apple trees, no almond trees, no pesticides. It's just wildflowers. And so the honey is harvested in this completely natural way.
Is this honey sold as something very special? I mean, do they see a premium for making this sort of sacrifice?
It is. It is sold as something very special, but there's also lots of commercial beekeepers who sell honey at every shop on the street. And that's sold at a lower price, so it's making it more difficult for these people in the small villages to make money.
And one of the issues that they're finding is that the commercial beekeepers are coming in because Kars honey is famous in Turkey, so they're coming in with bees from outside, whereas there's a Caucasian bee, the name of the bee is Caucasian bee, that's native to Kars. Because these outside bees are coming in, which are more prolific, which are able to bring in more honey, they're actually killing off this native bee. So it's kind of a dubious situation by which the government is encouraging people apparently to, do more honey production,
right?
But at the price of this native bee.
I mean, are people objecting to this? Because you're talking about Kars honey isn't going to be Kars honey.
Yeah.
People are definitely objecting. We had a sort of a funny situation. We went to interview this one beekeeper. So we started off, filming, and then another beekeeper comes up and can I talk? And then a third beekeeper comes up. And pretty soon we have the whole town
village
talking about
kids and
this
wives
issue.
and dogs and everything. And they usher us into one of the beekeepers' homes. And we sit down and they serve us honey with the comb still in it, on bread that's made in kind of is it a tandoor oven?
Yeah, similar to an Indian oven.
Yeah, and then Wnyc, which is kind of like a Turkish clotted cream, which is the top layer of cream that forms after you boil milk. And they serve it all on this bread, and it's like the most amazing, amazing thing.
Did they have any ideas for solutions to this problem?
The solution is really to have the government encourage maintenance of this type of Caucasian bee. So they've been petitioning the government to stop other bees being allowed into Kars because it's killing off their bees.
Yeah.
So they're just saying, stop that, encourage this. This is what is going to really make and continue the culture of Kars beekeeping, is to have the original bees and their delicious honey be made, as opposed to diluting it by making it available to anyone, to these commercial operations.
Right.
And to not give up. I mean, many of the beekeepers didn't get any honey this past year, but they won't stop. They still keep on trying, and they're not willing to do it the commercial way because it's something that's part of their history and their tradition, and they want it to stay alive.
And there were, in this village we visited, the number of traditional beekeepers had decreased dramatically over the last 10 years. Where a family has 10 hives. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Right.
And they sell it at the market. It's very special. You don't get to taste non-adulterated honey very often.
Complicated problem. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Daniel Klein and Mira Fine are creators of the perennialplate.com. Now, for more about their discoveries and a recipe for wheat berries with ricotta and honey, go to the website, splendidtable.org. Jane and Michael Stern can take on just about anything on a plate. In the decades that they've been tracking down prime